Is the Kreg Track Saw still the king of budget track saws in 2024? I wanted to find out, so I bought this one. Let's go. I reviewed this track saw on this channel about 2.5 years ago, and well, I wanted to know, is it still a good pick for budget options? I have reviewed a bunch of different track saws over the last couple of years, and now I have a really strong grasp of what makes a track saw good, great, or not so great. I wanted to put this one through the paces now that I have more experience with track saws. After we put this through the paces, we will also compare it to some of the other options that are in this price range and maybe some that are just a little more than this to find the right track saw for you and your shop. All right, out of the box, you do get the dust boot, first thing I pulled out, and then also the saw well wrapped in plastic. And then you also get the owner's manual that we know you're not gonna read, but you should. This actually is a really well-written manual, and it has a lot of pictures in it, which I like. And then it also is very thick because it got a couple of different languages in there, English, French, and Spanish, I believe. First thing I noticed out of the box is my previous review on this saw. I had a bag with it, and I don't know why this one doesn't have a bag. Maybe they just discontinued that. It's the same kit, so I'm not sure if I'm assuming they just discontinued the bag. It was quite pointless in my opinion anyway, but no bag. Carry bag, that is. Overall, I think the saw was well packaged. You don't have to worry about too much damage or anything like that during shipping. And this kit does come with a track, and what's interesting here is it's a 62-inch track. Almost every other track saw that I know of either comes with a 55-inch track or one of those short, I think it's 29.5-inch track, like the Rigid, the Ryobi, a couple of more I can't remember right now. But this one does come with that extra track. And why that matters is when you're cutting across the sheet of plywood, you're gonna see that you're able to take the saw before the cut and well after the cut. Gives you plenty of space to plunge, etc. And if you wanted to add another track to this, then you're gonna have more than enough to do an 8-foot sheet of plywood, MDF, etc. I like the fact that this is a longer track. It also comes with a little attachment, this end rail attachment. What that's for is so that it doesn't drag your cord or tear up your cord or your hose if you're using a dust extractor. It basically softens the end of that track. In other words, it just gives it a little ramp so your stuff didn't get scuffed up. Almost feel a little bit nostalgic because this was, again, the first track saw that I ever used and reviewed. It's pretty nice. Like out of the box, it still gives me that, this is a nice tool feeling. Feels really nice, got a good heft to it, not overly heavy, just you feel solid. It does have a metal base as well as a metal housing around the blade, and it just has a good overall feel to it. Now this track saw has a lot of safety features packed into it that some of the more other budget options don't have, or they don't have all of them combined, right? First and foremost, it does have a riving knife, and that is one of my biggest pet peeves of some of the other budget track saws. They don't have that riving knife. I like to see that. That prevents the wood from pinching behind you when you're making cuts, especially on sheet goods like plywood or even thicker woods when you're cutting through those and the wood grain is such that it just starts binding up. This riving knife will prevent that. Another safety feature this has is a blade break. It'll stop that from spinning for a very long time. I believe it was the Grizzly track saw, the other budget track saw that would just spin and spin and spin before it stopped. This does have a kind of a braid break. They advertise it as a braid break, and it does slow down a little bit faster, or a lot faster than, say, the Grizzly. And another safety feature this has is anti-kickback. You see this in some of the higher end saws, and I like to see that here. It is a red button on the base of this saw that when you turn it, it prevents it from sliding back. You'll see it right here. When you turn the red knob, you'll see it engage, and all that does is put a little tension or a cam on this track that it's riding on. It will slide smoothly going forward, but when it tries to go back, it kind of locks it in place. Prevents that from kicking back. That's key. I like that. So we got a riving knife and anti-kickback. Now on the first startup, you'll notice it has a lot of power. Just, you can feel it. It's a 12 amp motor on this. I think the Grizzly was a 9 amp, if I'm not mistaken. It felt way underpowered. This is on par with a lot of the other corded track saws like the Triton that have the 12 amp motor, which had plenty of power. I'm assuming this will too, but we're going to test it out. Now this does come with a dust boot as well, just to collect some of that dust, but those fill up rather quickly as seen in my previous review. If you have a dust extractor or some type of shop bag that you can connect to this, it is much, much better. And speaking of that, my Festool hose fits in there perfectly, and this does have a dust adapter that does pivot. Pivot! Pivot! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! It does have a positive stop at 45, and there is a switch on the side here that you will have to push down to get it to go all the way to the 47. Coming back to the -1, it will positive stop at 0. There is a switch right here that you flip, and let it drop down to the -1. Now for depth adjustment on this saw, I like the fact that they have marked that where the 3/4 inch plywood is, as well as where the max depth is. I typically don't like these single pole or single, I don't know what you call it, the ones that don't have the push button that move, like the Rigid or the Milwaukee or the Festool. All of those have like a push button, you slide and it locks in place. And some of these other ones like this one, I think the Ryobi had this and the Triton. I didn't care for these, but on this Kreg, it works much better than any of those others. It doesn't hang up, it slides very smooth and it locks down easily. So if I was trying to set it that the pre-marked 3/4 inch plywood, I could literally just move it and set it and it's not a problem. Those other ones were really, really jinky. This one is not. So I really don't mind that this is just a single thumb screw style versus the button. Now on top of the saw, it only has 2 modes. There's not any scribe cutting here. You'll literally just set the depth if you wanted the scribe cut. It doesn't have a quick scribe cut like some of the other saws, but it does have a quick blade change. And what that does is you flip it to the gear icon with the wrench, and then you're gonna be able to, when you plunge it, it's going to lock or stop, hard stop that, where the arbor is in that window so that you can change it out. And then on top, there's also an arbor lock button that you will press to prevent that from spinning. And for changing the blade and any other adjustments you're going to need on this tool, it does have 2 included wrenches that store into the handle, so you can make those adjustments easily. And when you are in the blade change mode, when you flip it over, when you plunge it down, it actually does just stop there. You can see it stops and you don't have to worry about trying to hold that in place or anything like that. One complaint I do have about this way it locks into place so you can change the blade is sometimes it gets stuck, and it might take you a minute to get it fixed back. It's meant to push down once to unlock, but sometimes it just doesn't work that way. Most of the time it does, but sometimes it takes a couple tries. And speaking of blades, this does come with a 48 tooth blade, which is going to be really good, should be really good for plywood, MDF, etc. And I think it'll perform pretty well on cutting the thicker woods, which we're fixing to find out. Another feature of this saw that a lot of track saws don't have, the Milwaukee has it, I think the Rigid has it. It's the on-track, off-track indicator, so you can use this as a regular circular saw. So that 0 is if you're just cutting a straight 90-degree cut, and then the 45, of course, if you're making bevel cuts off the track. That's just an indicator to let you know where the blade's going to cut. Now when you first get your saw, you're going to have to do a couple of things to get it ready to run. First and foremost this is called a splinter guard, I believe is what they call it, but this is adjustable. You can adjust it with one of those wrenches that are stored in the handle, the smaller of the 2. You can move this up and down depending on how it's setting on your stock that you're cutting, plywood, etc. Once you get it set, you should be good to go. Now one thing you will have to do though is turn the saw on and plunge it so that it actually cuts this, because it will trim it to fit the saw, and that really gives you like a 0 clearance style cut, like if you were using that on the table saw that has a 0 clearance. That really does prevent splintering and etc. That's why these are on there, especially on some of these nicer saws. You will also have to cut the track to fit the blade as well, because it does have a splinter guard running the length of this thing. So you will see those blue shavings, and that's what that is. You're trimming this blue splinter guard so that you get that 0 clearance to this blade. I showed you the end guard, cord guard, hose guard. That's really nice. It's easy to install, like takes you seconds to put that on or take it off with a thumb screw. Again, this is a 62-inch track. Nobody else is doing this as far as I know. I like that they're including that, and this does have that anti-slip on the bottom so that you don't need clamps and things like that. If you're just cross-cutting plywood, etc., this should stick just fine. Now this is a non-standard track. In other words, you can't use a Milwaukee or a Festool track saw on this track because Kreg has their own thing, and Kreg's track saws run opposite direction of the other track saws on the market. Not that that's a bad thing, you push it the other way. Before we get to the power and performance cutting through materials with this saw, check out my new tool company, faithvaluetools.com. We have the only woodworker's ledger book. It's called the Woodworker's Chronicle. It helps you keep up with orders, keep up with customer quotes, as well as diagrams of your favorite projects. That way you can reference them back later. We also have card scrapers and more tools coming soon. faithvaluetools.com. Go check me out. When you first get these, typically you have to do some type of adjustment. And this Kreg Track Saw is probably one of the easiest ones I've ever had to adjust. It's super simple. Literally there's 2 knobs, 2 black knobs, one on the front, one on the back. And you can see there's some wiggle back here on the back. All you gotta do is turn this slightly, just slightly, until all of that slop is gone. You're gonna do that on the front and on the back. Once that's gone, you're ready to cut because you've removed all of the play in there. Now, if you over tighten these, it will be very difficult to push forward. That's when you know you've got it over tightened. You should have a little blue strip, looks like that when you cut the splinter guard. That's perfectly natural. You'll also probably see a little blue dust everywhere. And in the initial part of the track where you first start cutting, there's going to be a little piece that your saw just won't reach as it moves to the back. But you can also trim that up, just removing that guard, moving it back a little bit, take care of that. One thing I do like about Kreg's track is it's a good quality track. Some of these lower end budget option tracks don't have good grippy on the bottom, and like their splinter guard, like the Grizzly, was just falling off out of the box. It was just complete trash. This is very good. The splinter guard sticks, it's not falling off or anything like that. And when you set it on a piece of plywood, it literally almost feels like it's glued to it. It doesn't slip and slide around, and that's what you want out of a good quality track. Milwaukee is similar, Festool, so you're getting that quality, that level of quality on the track, especially on that anti-slip stuff on the bottom. I appreciate that they do that. Cutting the plywood, there was a couple of observations here that I was quite impressed with. Number one was dust collection. I don't remember the dust collection being this good on this saw, and that's without even an arbor cover here. My friend Drew Witt at Whitworks makes these covers that pop right in place. I'll link to that down in the description. It will help dust collection, but honestly, it's very good even without that, and that's rare in most of these track saws. The second observation is it cut plenty power, etc. It was just fine. Now, one thing that I noticed on the first cut was I was getting a tiny bit of splintering, a little more than I like to see on plywood with a track saw. And I was like, oh, I need to adjust this splinter guard down and make sure that it goes all the way down and touches your stock like the plywood. When I first set it, it was still just slightly above the surface. When I set it to the correct depth, it done a little bit better, but there's still a little bit of splintering cross-cutting this plywood. In other words, across the grain of this veneer. Some of the other track saws have performed better in this area, but this one isn't really bad. It's just a tiny bit of splintering as you see here. But that is on the offcut piece. On the actual piece of plywood that the track was setting on, there's zero splintering there, which is what you want to see. One thing to note, if you do have the anti-kickback on, when you take it off the track and put it back on the track, it may not seat all the way down. You may need to flip that switch and let it sit down on the track and then re-engage it. Cutting through walnut, it did pretty good. Now, as far as power goes, it had plenty of power. I did notice a little bit of what I'm going to call chattering, almost like a vibration. And what I think that is, the blade is too high of a tooth count to be ripping much. Like if you was going to do a whole bunch of ripping on thicker woods, you would absolutely want to get a lower tooth count blade. That would help tremendously. But it did have plenty of power and didn't notice any power issues at all. On the first cut through this, I think it's almost 1.7/8, almost 2 inches thick walnut. I got some burning as stated because this blade is just a little bit too high of a tooth count. And I also noticed that it was not square, and I thought, man, that kind of stinks. And then I remembered I didn't check the base to the blade to make sure it's square. Make sure you unplug it, and you're going to plunge it all the way down and take a good square that you trust. Make sure you're not landing on a tooth, and you're going to hold it on the front and the back of the blade. Because it has two different points that you can bevel this, you want to make sure both sides or both ends are square. Once I did that, I recut and I got a square cut. As you can see, I went about halfway through. I checked one side for square, the new side that I just cut, it was square, and the old side, obviously, out of square. So make sure that you square up the base to the blade. Now, as far as bevel cuts, I'm not going to do a bevel cut because this blade is having enough trouble going through even 2-inch thick walnut. So if I try to do a bevel cut right now, I know what's going to happen. It's just going to bog down. It's just not going to perform well. Also, on almost all of these saws in this price range, what you're going to see is quite a bit of deflection left and right. When you put pressure on the base, you see the saw handles kind of wiggling here. And what that's doing is also moving the blade down there. If you know about that deflection, it's not overly a major deal. Just make sure don't put any pressure left or right. When you're making that cut, as you saw, I could make a clean cut. I just took it slow and made sure I not pressure one way or the other. Just good straightforward pressure. You're gonna see that in all these budget level saws. I've seen it in Triton, in the Win, in the Ryobi, and obviously this Kreg here. It's not a huge deal, just something to be aware of so that you don't push too much pressure. Most people though are buying this for the ability to break down sheet goods efficiently, in other words fast and accurately, and that's what a track saw is mainly geared, especially at this price point, geared to. And I love, by far, my favorite tool to use in the shop, pretty obvious probably of all the reviews I've done, is the track saw. I love these tools. They make cutting sheet goods so much faster than trying to wrestle it onto a table saw, especially if you have a small job site saw or even a contractor style saw and you're trying to wrestle a full sheet. It's a pain in the rear. And track saws just make it much, much better. Another great feature is this is actually a plunge saw. In other words, you can just plunge where it's sitting. If I wanted to start right here and just plunge into this cut and then go, I can certainly do that. I did that on the piece of walnut and just basically started about 3 inches from the end, plunged, and then went. One of the reasons you're able to do that is because of that riving knife, the way it comes out and then kind of goes under the blade. Unlike the Ryobi, which was operated with the blade, it's just a bad design in my opinion. This is a much better design. This is on par with the Rigid as well as the Milwaukee, etc. Now, how does this compare to the Rigid, the Triton, and maybe even the Milwaukee if you're looking to spend a little more? The most obvious competitor to me to the Kreg is the Triton. The Triton track saw probably lines up in price. By the time you add the saw and the track, you're going to be pretty close to the same price, maybe within $30 or $40. And as far as performance goes, etc. The Triton depth adjustment, all the adjustments are very similar to this track saw, except the Triton did not have that riving knife, which I love, love, love having on a track saw. It also didn't have the splinter guard that dropped down, and the dust collection was much less than this. So now that I've used the Triton and back to the Kreg, I'm almost leaning back toward the Kreg being the superior product because of the dust collection, the riving knife, the blade break, the anti-kickback, and the overall performance of the saw. It's a really nice saw. So which one should you go with, Triton or Kreg? It totally depends on what you prefer. A lot of people are probably going to go with the Kreg just because of the name brand, the reliability, this proven form factor over the last several years, and I wouldn't have any problems with that. I did like the Triton, thought it performed extremely well. But I've also been impressed again with the Kreg 2.5 years later. They haven't changed the design, it's just still a good solid design moving forward. Now I get a question a lot, which would you get, the Rigid or the Kreg? That depends. Now the Rigid's adjustments are much more refined. I like them a lot better. You can read them easier, everything works better. It just feels like a better made saw all the way around. I like it a lot. However, if you're not in the Rigid battery platform and you don't want to get another Rigid battery or another battery platform, then you probably don't want to go with the Rigid. But the Rigid does have the on-track and off-track depth scale where the Kreg only has the on-track. This does have anti-tip as well, and the Kreg does not have that. So if you go to a bevel of 45 degree, you could leave this setting on the track without having to worry about it falling off. The Triton had that as well. But the Kreg doesn't have anti-tip, so if you tilt it to 45 and you let go, it will likely fall off. And then there's the case of tracks. Both of these have proprietary tracks. The Kreg works on the Kreg track, and the Rigid only works on the Rigid track. But the Rigid tracks come in those shorter lengths, especially if you buy the combo kit without the long track. They do offer the longer tracks, so it just depends on if you want to get into this battery platform or not. I think Rigid makes a good solid saw. One of my favorite, by far one of my favorite track saws that I own is the Milwaukee track saw. I bought this almost 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago or so. Maybe a little over a year ago, maybe. I don't remember. It's been a while. It's been fantastic. I love this saw. The only one I like better is the Festool, but I'm a giant Festool fanboy. But this is a really, really good track saw. I love how it does have on-track and on-track depth. The depth adjustment's very easy, and all of the adjustments and everything on this saw are really, really well done. Really smooth bevel, really nice plunging action. This also has that riving knife just like the Kreg. This does have an easier to adjust toolless splinter guard that you can just drop down. Of course, I've got my dust cover on there as well. This also has a fine tuning knob on that depth adjustment, so if you're just close and you want to just a little more or just a little less, you can fine tune it with that little twist knob there. And this is variable speed where the Kreg is not. Kreg is single speed, as far as I can tell. And even on battery power, this had plenty of power to power through anything I wanted to cut. Plenty of battery life. Again, just an overall, all-around amazing saw. But there is a large price difference between the Milwaukee and the Kreg, so it just depends on where your budget's at. If you do pick up the Kreg track saw, I recommend picking up the guide rail square from TSO. I have one that fits on my Milwaukee and on my Festool tracks. Same one fits those, but they have their own for Kreg that will work with that Kreg track. This makes cutting up sheet goods very, very fast. It's literally like turning your track saw into a giant square. You literally just move it to one mark, make the cut, move it to the next mark, make the cut. These are extremely handy and they go on and off fast. Just a good all-around product or accessory for the track saw. And I would pick up that dust port. You see I have them both on the Rigid and on the Milwaukee. It really does, and on the Festool, it really does help with that dust collection. Those are a couple of accessories I highly recommend. Overall, for the price, what you're paying for this track saw, I think it's an amazing value even 2.5 years later. And this also goes with the adaptive cutting system. In other words, their table. I reviewed that as well. I'll link to that at the end of this video if you're interested, but it's basically like the Festool MFT table, but in Kreg form. Much lower cost than if you bought the Festool track saw and the Festool MFT. It still get very similar functions there with that table, especially for small shops. It might be the perfect solution for you if you don't have a table saw or if you just don't have a whole lot of space. All in all, I think if you're in market for a really good track saw that won't break the bank as far as track saws go, check out the Kreg. In the meantime, go check out that adaptive cutting system review right there. Clicking that box gets you the big old virtual fist bump. Also the Milwaukee track saw review if you want to check that one out.